Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my action research project. My topic focused on coping and dealing with student stress and anxiety in the classroom during COVID-19 and beyond. So initially my plan for the action research project was to go into the classroom in October and try to assess whether or not student anxiety had increased since returning to the classroom during the pandemic. Unfortunately, I did not get a placement in October, so I had to change my plans a little bit. And what I ended up doing was looking into some research about different coping strategies that teachers and researchers have found work well for student anxiety. Now, one of the limitations of this research topic was that there really hasn't been a lot, if any, research done about student anxiety and COVID-19 thus far. But I think it was still worthwhile to look into, and this presentation is going to tell you a little bit about what we know about anxiety and the pandemic so far, and different coping strategies that we can readily implement into the classroom to help students deal with their anxieties. So the purpose of this project and this assignment was to assess student anxiety and look at people of various ages and try to identify several coping strategies that teachers can readily implement into their daily classroom routine that can help combat student anxiety and help manage their stress. And like I already said, one limitation of the study is that we don't really have a lot of research so far. And the studies that have been conducted so far on the impact of COVID-19 and mental health have focused more on young adult populations and some post-secondary student populations rather than school-aged children. But there can still be links to how young people might be affected, so it's still worth taking a look at. Not to mention, student anxiety has existed well before COVID-19 and unfortunately will continue in the coming years beyond the pandemic. So for this reason, it's still important to view this research with a wide lens and really take a look at how we can implement coping strategies in the classroom for COVID-19 related anxiety, but also just for the general anxieties that come with being a school-age child and going to school every day and having other things going on in your life. So I'll just start by just a brief summary of some of the literature that is available right now. And what I decided to do was break it up into two parts. So some of the literature is going to focus on assessing student anxiety. So that is looking at whether or not anxiety is actually present in students and in the classroom, especially in the context of COVID-19. There was a lot more information regarding actually assessing and defining student anxiety during COVID-19, whereas the research hasn't really gotten to the point of what can we do about it. And these two studies listed here, in the first one, Liang, in I believe it was April of 2020, researchers attempted to identify the effects of COVID-19 on youth mental health. So they looked at people from ages 14 to 35, and they made predictions that public health crises such as COVID-19, SARS, and MERS in past years, how these health crises can lead many people to experience psychological distress in the form of either PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other psychological stressors. So in the subsequent sections, I'll get into the results of their study and what they recommend going forward. Likewise, Wang and Zhao in 2020 as well looked at Chinese university students and attempted to assess anxiety levels during the onset of the pandemic, so around April and May, when and even March, when students were unsure about what would be happening with school. Based on their findings, they suggest that some degree of stress and anxiety is expected from the public during a global pandemic, and they go on to state that students were at a greater risk for psychological distress during the pandemic than other populations for a number of reasons, which I'll get into. Next, a Canadian university student named Sierra Badgley wrote a reflective piece in Anxiety Canada just after the onset of the pandemic here in Canada. So she describes the summer months prior to returning to school as feeling very lonely. She felt very isolated, and there was a high degree of uncertainty. She goes on to explain that the uncertainty of the upcoming school year was accompanied by intense feelings of stress and anxiety, and that the unknown was really the scariest part for her. And surely a lot of students felt the same way, not knowing what was going to happen, whether or not they were even going to be going back to school in September, whether or not it was going to be virtual or in class. Another study discusses some of the disadvantages of the lockdown measures that were taken at the early stages of the pandemic, and these students describe feelings of boredom, loneliness, not having a lot of opportunities for exercise or outdoor activities, very limited opportunities to gather with friends, and no extracurricular activities. So these are often things that people use to reduce their stress and anxiety, hanging out with friends, playing sports, getting exercise. These are all things that can actually really improve your mental health, and they explain that by being unable to do these things due to lockdown measures, they felt that their feelings were only perpetuated and felt more fear and anxiety than before. So the next section focuses on identifying coping strategies. So in Cousins 2020, which is a news report from CTV, Cousins reports that Stephen Taylor, who's a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychiatry, he recommends that teachers and parents stress the impermanency of anxious feelings to their students and their children. He believed that once students settled back into routine, that things would just kind of go back to normal and the feelings would just go away over time. But I think if student anxiety is anything like this pandemic has been, it's not going away anytime soon, and just ignoring the problem is not going to make it go away. So there has to be, this is a start, reassuring your students, but there has to be something more concrete that we can do. So another article in Anxiety Canada recommends that teachers model effective coping strategies to the students. So I'll start with this one just by saying if a teacher is coming to school stressed and anxious every day, that's going to translate to the students. And so they suggest modeling effective coping strategies to the students. If you model the strategies laid out here yourself, then students will follow. And the next one would be having open and honest conversations as a class about the realities of the pandemic and feelings of anxiety. This could be a 5-minute conversation that you have at the beginning of a lesson or at the beginning of the day, and it just makes students feel reassured and lets them know that you're there for them. And finally, they recommend using soothing music in the classroom and making time for exercise breaks. So there are a few different studies and articles that recommend these kinds of things. Using soothing music in the classroom, this could be at the beginning of the day, it can be during transitions, during lunch. This can be really helpful for students just to regroup and to kind of ease their mind. And making time for exercise breaks, of course, allowing them to get their body moving and even taking them outside. So this Jones, Riggs, and Keogh in 2019 was actually an action research project in grade 7 and 8 classrooms in the United States. And they use an action research design with the goal of helping students identify and navigate their own anxiety. So the researchers really stress the role of the teacher in this particular example, and their responsibility in providing students with the tools they need to manage their anxieties. So initially they assessed student anxiety using questionnaires and interviews, and then the intervention section of the study offers 4 strategies that can be readily integrated into any classroom, and these are something that I will talk about in just a few minutes. Not every study used the same method and the same data collection procedures. So essentially, just depending on the purpose of the study or the scale of the study, each research project was using different methods, including surveys, self-assessments, checklists, basic observation, and interviews. And the number of participants for all of the studies also varied. So for example, Liang's study in 2020 They surveyed nearly 600 participants, and these were all between the ages of 14 and 35. And in contrast, Jones, Riggs, and Keogh in 2019 used a smaller sample of just under 70 middle school students. All the different data has something different to offer. It just depends on the purpose of the study. So for example, from Jones, Riggs, and Keogh in 2019, this table right here depicts the survey that was given to the 7th and 8th grade students online, which was prior to any intervention. So this was just a way of assessing test anxiety among the students. Again, not COVID-19 related. This was before the onset of COVID-19 in the United States. So they were assessing what they felt was the biggest stressor for this age of students, which was testing. Students were asked to rate how they felt about different statements before, during, and after a test. So the results part of this is actually the most interesting part, because a lot of these strategies can be immediately implemented into any classroom. So I'm just going to give a brief summary of just some of the most significant findings. Liang and her colleagues in 2020 concluded that participants in junior high school or below, their survey looked at people from ages 14 to 35, so we're looking at around the 14-year-old age range. So this demographic was more prone to psychological distress, and they suggested that they may even experience long-term mental health issues during a public health emergency. And they go on to recommend that governments take additional measures to help this particular population recover from the impact of the pandemic. Wang and Zhao, similarly in 2020, concluded that Chinese university students experienced more anxiety than the general population during the outbreak of COVID-19. So students in particular were more prone to the negative psychological effects of the pandemic. They suggest that in order to combat students' feelings of stress, fear, or uncertainty, instructors that are delivering online classes, which is the way that delivery was being done at the time, that the instructors strongly consider the findings and help provide the necessary supports for their students. Health Central, which is an online article from 2018, features Dr. Jerry Kennard, who recommends several classroom interventions for students with anxiety, including having a safe space, or I've also heard it be called a calm corner, in the classroom for students to go to when their anxiety symptoms are high or they're feeling overwhelmed. I had one of these in my placement classroom last year. It had like a comfy chair, some posters on mindful breathing. It's just a place that students can go if they're starting to feel overwhelmed with emotions or they just need a break. He also recommends posting the expectations or the daily routine for the day in the classrooms. And so this is just so that students know what to expect throughout the day, and it helps avoid any surprises that could cause anxiety. Again, playing soothing or upbeat music during downtime or first thing in the morning, and incorporating exercise and mindful breathing breaks during transitions or in the middle of a lesson even. Sometimes it can just help to have students stand up, take a few deep breaths, and just help them regroup. This can also be done before a test. So Joan, Riggs, and Keogh from 2019, their action research project in the 7th and 8th grade classrooms. Their first intervention strategy was to give students fidgets. So they had fidgets and manipulatives that were readily available all day in the classroom and that students could access whenever they needed it. These fidgets actually reduce stress and help students refocus. They are able to stay focused longer and remain attentive for longer when they are fidgeting with an object. Second was the implementation of mindfulness, and they did this using two apps, one called Calm and one called Mind Yeti. And so these two apps both have things like calming music, guided meditations, different calming meditative stories, and video lessons on mindful movement and stretching. They actually go on to say that people managing stress and anxiety actually do a lot better when managing them with a group. So these things can be done with the class as a whole and can actually help students reduce their stress with the whole group activities. They're also short enough to be included into the daily schedule without occupying a lot of instructional time. The third strategy they used was this one was actually really cool, and I thought that this was a good one because you could have this in any classroom, and it was the use of mandala coloring sheets that would have positive affirmations on them. They gave students mandala coloring sheets, specifically mandalas, because of their intricate and complex geometric shapes. And they suggested that because they're reasonably complex, they may actually induce a state of mind that is similar to that of meditation, which can be helpful for those with anxiety. And then finally, they gave a checklist, which I'm going to show you, of test-taking skills. A lot of the students in the study expressed fear about tests just because they didn't have the skills and the tools they needed to effectively take them. So the researchers decided to implement a checklist for them. So the checklist actually included test-taking tips for students to refer to during tests or before submitting them. This is a copy of the test-taking checklist. Students were asked to check off at the end or during the test if they had finished all these tasks, and students, knowing that they had done all of these things that were expected of them, experienced a lot less anxiety after submitting the test. So some considerations and limitations to some of the studies in this presentation were, one, of course, validity. It's always a concern for research papers and journal articles. Some of the larger scale studies with the surveys described having concerns about validity just because of either the sample size or how many people actually submitted a survey. The main concern for a lot of teachers was a loss of instructional time. To me, the answer is simple, because if you continue with the instruction, but 2, 5, or 10 of the students aren't focused on what you're saying at all because they're so stressed out about the test at the end of the week, then it's better just to take the 5 minutes to do the guided meditation, and then hopefully you bring a few, if not all, of those students back, and they'll be more ready to learn. There was also considerations made for cost, particularly if you have things like the fidgets or the manipulatives. Who pays for these? Things like the Calm app, I believe, also is a subscription. Distractions, again, the fidgets and the manipulatives, they have to be used properly, and then there has to be some sort of protocol in place. If they're not being used properly, what are the consequences? And then finally, teacher training, having teachers have the professional development and knowing how to use these strategies and how to properly implement them. And again, being able to really recognize student anxiety. Even if you have one student that's suffering from anxiety, implementing these strategies isn't going to hinder the ones that aren't. I mean, every student is just going to benefit from having one, even just one 5-minute break in the middle of a lesson for a stretch, or for a guided breathing exercise, or being able to do some fun coloring at the end of a test. So the research thus far shows that there is a strong probability that a global health crisis like COVID-19 can have a negative effect on people's mental health, and that it may cause an increased anxiety for young students in particular as they return to school. And of course, this is something that we're not going to know for several months. We're not going to know the whole picture of COVID-19 on mental health. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done on the effects of COVID-19 and mental health, and how these effects can translate to the classroom in particular. But we can start by considering what strategies have been helpful pre-COVID-19 in mitigating student anxiety and build on them. I hope that this research is useful to many people. I believe I now have a repertoire of strategies to use in my own classroom that can be useful to myself, not only to myself, but to also share with others. And they also don't need to be done every day. They can be used during more stressful times of the year, such as during exams. They can be done before a test or after a test, or even if you just notice that it's an off day, a 10-minute break to go outside early before the end of the day can help. And what's important is that these strategies have been, they're tried and true, and they've been tested by teachers and researchers, especially the action research. This has shown that they can help students suffering from anxiety or help prevent it altogether at little to no cost or really loss of time or anything. So thank you for listening, and I hope that maybe even one or two of these strategies resonated with you, and I would highly recommend looking into some of these references. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.